So we continue our discussion about optimal portfolio formation, and now we talk about the case when we have a portfolio out of two assets. And let's assume that one of the asset is riskless. We will call it asset S. Uh, it has a positive returns, but its risk or deviation is equal to zero. The other asset is risky, so its return is higher than the asset S, and its deviation is positive, which means it's just not clear. There is uncertainty about the possible earnings. In this case, if we have a decision to do how much money invest in one of the other asset, the possible combinations would be linear. Um, so with the two extreme points, one would be when we hold only S, so we hold only riskless asset, then the yield of our investment portfolio would be equal to its assets S yield multiplied by the total wealth investment with no risk. And if we, on the other extreme point, we have all the investment in X2 or risky asset, so the yield probably is gonna be higher, but though the portfolio would be risky. If we have half of our investment in S and a half of our investment in X2, so we have a combined portfolio with its return equal to the half of return of S and half of return of X2. And as the asset S is riskless, so the risk of the portfolio would be half of the risk of the X2. We can plot everything in a graph and see the possible combinations for optimal portfolio. So on the horizontal axis, we have risk, and on the vertical axis, we have earnings or returns. And so the line SB represents the possible combinations of our investment portfolio. But the point S would represent all our investment being in the asset S, or riskless asset S. That's why the risk is equal to zero. So it gives us positive return. When in the point B, we would have all our assets invested in the in B, with the risk equal to the B and the maximum possible earnings equal to the assets B earnings. We also could be on any point on this line, which would simply say how much S and how much of B do we have in our portfolio. Of course, we introduce the asset S here as the riskless assets because we aim to show the role of investment in money, or the role of money as one of the financial instruments in investment portfolio. So investment in money is riskless. So in reality, if you hold cash, if you save cash, it doesn't give you any return. So also the return of your riskless asset in this case would be equal to zero. What changes then? Then the possible combinations of the optimal portfolio would be on that red line, saying that if we invest everything in money, if we hold all our savings in money, there is no risk about possible outcome. 100 euros will be 100 euros after any 10 years, 20 years, or 100 years. But with no return, as it's not going to change, as it's not going to increase. And again, we have B on the other side. So if we invest all our wealth in the risky asset, what combination exactly we are going to choose depends on our willingness and on our attitude towards risk. What do we like? Um, um, so what's the difference, or how the choice is made, is usually explained by analyzing investment portfolio out of risky assets. And let's say now that both of the assets, X1 and X2 in the portfolio, are risky, and so their variance is more than zero. Um, and so we have some share of our wealth in asset X1 and in asset X2. What would be the possible optimal portfolio? So what would be the possibilities to optimize our portfolios? I mean, for the highest gains on the acceptable risk. There are many combinations, and they mainly depend on the correlation of the linkage between the returns of those two assets. In one case, those two assets may have perfect positive correlation when P12 would be equal to 1, meaning that if the returns of one asset increases, let's say by 10%, so the returns of the other asset would also increase by 1%, by 10%. So in this case, the variance of the portfolio would become way greater, and the returns would be equal to returns of both of the assets. And this would make the possible optimal combinations of the possible portfolios a linear line. And we can present it graphically. In picture A, the line AB represents the possible combinations in the portfolio or the two risky assets A and B, with A being of a bit smaller risk and smaller returns, and B of bigger risk and bigger returns. When their correlation is equal to 1, so when both of the returns move in the same way, so for a person, it makes almost no difference, or there's no possibility to reduce risk when combining the instruments, but it can then choose what gain he or she would like to have and what risk is acceptable. The opposing scenario is when the correlation of the returns between of two assets is perfectly negative. That it means it is equal to -1. So then the returns of one asset increases by 10%, the returns of the other asset would decrease by 10%. So which means that they move in opposite directions at the same time, and that gives us a possibility of reducing risk, aiming to have higher gains. The combination of those of that portfolio would be illustrated in a picture B, and it would be a line ASB. As here, remember, shows us the riskless asset, which means that we can have a particular combination of the asset A and B in our portfolio, minimizing the risk or reducing the risk completely, because the returns of those two assets move in opposing ways. We can have a particular combination when actually they would the decrease of one asset would offset the increase in the other asset, and so we could know our earnings for sure, and that's what that S represents. So this gives us opportunity of having optimal portfolio, and when the correlation of the two assets is negative, it allows us for having higher returns on the same risk. It means that, for example, even if you are very risk averse, you would not buy only A because it still gives you quite high risk with low returns. So you can have way higher returns on the same risk if you include more of the asset B in your portfolio, or you can reduce risk totally by having riskless portfolio with higher returns and only investing in A. So the negative correlation allows for reduction of risk. then, despite those two cases that we discussed, A and B, there are many other cases when the correlation of A and B could be from -1 to 1, any positive or any negative value. In this case, it means that the combinations of the optimal portfolio would be somewhere from a portfolio with a perfect positive correlation and portfolio with a perfectly negative correlation. So we have this triangle ASB, and the combinations of the portfolios of those two risky assets would be somewhere here inside this triangle, depending on the correlation the returns of those two assets have. Okay, but usually we can choose way more assets for investment than only two. And what about if we have three assets just to choose? The optimal area changes a bit. And it says that if we have three assets, A, D, and B, and we aim to have a combination of them too in our portfolio, they could be correlated in different ways. So the optimal portfolio would be somewhere inside in this gray area. And so for each particular individual, the choice of a particular combination of those three assets would depend on his or her indifference line. That is where exactly or what exactly risk a person agrees to take, having in mind the possible earnings. And this says that this curved line also indicates that we can always look for better or higher returns on the same risk, and that's why even risk-averse people may agree on investing. They don't need necessarily to accept very high risk, but including more assets in your portfolio allows to reduce the risk, or actually to have higher returns with the same risk. And that's why this portfolio diversification gives a chance for investment in financial assets and equities. What if one of the assets in the portfolio is riskless? So what if we have an asset which earnings is known? So in this case, we can prolong the line here, saying that if the risk is decreasing with way bigger decrease in returns, a person would shift to investing into riskless asset or increasing the share of riskless asset in the portfolio. And now we can compare those two graphs here, which shows exactly the same portfolios, exactly the same possibilities for investment, but different choices. As you see, the place of the indifference curves in those two graphs are different, saying that one person in the first picture is very risk averse and agrees on way lower risk. So on the other picture, a person is more is maybe a risk indifferent or prefers the risk, so the indifference curve is upper, and that's, you see that their choice of investment portfolio would be different. The first person would concentrate mainly on investing in riskless asset, and the share of a riskless asset is going to be quite high, as this is the only possibility for him or her to reduce the risk, while the second person would invest almost nothing in riskless asset because he or she doesn't wants way higher earnings on the risk accepted. And so these two pictures also illustrates the difference, the difference in choices. and depending on the willingness, on the risk preference of different investors, and that says why sometimes it's so complicated to estimate the speculative demand for money for an entire country. So on one hand, okay, speculative demand for money depends on standard deviation and correlations of expected terminal values. So it depends on very many factors that are changing constantly in the economy. Also, it depends on the moods and expectations of the market participants and their perceptions. So it says that there are even more factors than we included into our analysis, which are way more difficult to measure and to estimate. And so that's why it's just so complicated to estimate the speculative demand for money. Also, demand functions for bonds and equities are constantly changing in the economy, and so the speculative demand for money function is not stable. That's why here we will not find the function of speculative demand for money. The last question is there a positive portfolio demand for money in the modern economy? Is it still does it make any sense to talk about speculative demand for money, about money as asset in investment portfolio in the modern economy? On one hand, what we said, okay, money is very attractive as it is riskless, and so it allows for people to reduce risk, okay, lowering returns but reducing risk. Though in modern economies, we can find more instruments almost riskless, like deposit in a bank, in a trustworthy old commercial bank. There's almost, again, no risk on putting deposit in a bank, though its advantage is that it gives returns, while the money doesn't give any. And so why would people choose to have money instead of putting a deposit in a bank? In general, in modern economy, there are more and more risks, or the risk of different investment financial instruments is decreasing. And that's really a question, why could anyone hold money instead of any other financial asset? Um, so it's a question with maybe no answer, because what we said, that people would agree on holding money for investment or speculative motives because this is their chance to reduce the risk, and very risk averse people would see it as a big opportunity. But if we have more instruments with higher returns but with lower risks, so why should we choose money? So, but we could think about maybe some people or maybe some other countries which are not so way developed, which where financial systems are not so stable and not so trustworthy. And in these countries, having cash or saving cash might seem very advantageous, as it gives a chance for people to reduce the risk, as all the other instruments in the economy are way more risky.